Okay, so you're gonna make sure that you add your water in to whatever amount you need. Put your lid on, put your nozzle here just over the hole. And then we're gonna come down here. We're going to turn the Brewzilla on. Automatically, you'll see the heater will be paused. So what we're gonna do is we're going to set our temperature. So I've looked at my recipe and I need to get my water up to 72 degrees Celsius. So I'm gonna hit temp here. This will flash. So now I can set it to my desired temperature. And now I can start the heater. I'm going to want to make sure that my pump, both my heaters are turned on. Okay, so now I've got my elements on. They're going to heat the water. I want to make sure that the water is recycling through to kind of get the temperature moving through the water. So I'm going to turn my pump on. And I'm going to turn my nozzle on here all the way so that the water is recycling through quickly. And now this is my current temperature right now, so it's 49 degrees. It's got to go all the way up to 72. All right, so here's the grain portion. So once your water is all heated up, you've got your grain drum empty right now. We've got all these other parts. So this here with the thread is the bottom. We're going to have this pipe with the thread threaded into here. And then you'll notice there's a groove right here. This clamp right here, push down, and you're going to kind of push that pipe in just past this thread here. And then we've got this cap here that goes at the end of this tube right here, and that's just to prevent the grain from falling through. All right, so we've got it together, and you'll notice this here now, because it's past that little groove, it can go up or down, so we can adjust the height of this. This here is the lid that will go above it once you've got your grain on. Okay, so now we put this in here, and now we can put our grain in there. Okay, so if we look at the recipe here, so we're heating up so we started with 17 liters of water at 72 degrees Celsius. So that's kind of our mash in. So we want to get the water to that temperature. Then we can add our grain. And then we want to have the temperature for our kind of cooking. So that hour, so that's 60 minutes, that's 67 degrees. So basically they've figured out that the grain at room temperature, if you add it to 72 degrees of water, it'll cool down the water to 67. It may cool it off a little bit more, but basically you want to bring your temperature up to 67 degrees once you've got your grain in there, and you're going to leave it at that temperature for an hour. So if I look at my machine right now, I've got it set to 72. It's got it to 71, which is close enough. You can see that the heaters are turned off, so it means it's not heating anymore, so it's keeping it at that temperature. So we're going to pause that. We're going to turn off our pump right now. Okay, and I'm actually also going to close the pump here. Okay, so we've got our grain container ready. Make sure that anything that kind of could potentially touch the beer has been sanitized and rinsed. So I've done that already. I've put together the bottom with the tube and the cap to make sure the grain doesn't fall through. Okay, and now we take our grain. So basically I just cut off one of the corners and we add the grain to the pot. Okay, so you'll notice the grain is now in the pot. You can see, so my table, basically have most of it covered in paper towel. It just makes cleanup easier. Then also I don't worry about putting sanitized stuff on it. So we're going to take the handle and we're going to place the handle in here so that we can lift it. Careful, it tends to slip sometimes, so just be careful when you're picking it up. Okay, so we're going to move our spigot out of the way. We'll take the lid off. And now we're going to take our grain pot and put it in the machine. All right, so the grain is in. I usually take the handle out. So now we're going to turn our pump back on. And the key now is to kind of mix the water into the grain. So we want to make sure that you kind of stir it so that there's no clumps of dry stuff. This will turn our pump back on, making sure that our spigot is a little off to the side, because if it goes straight in the center, it'll just go through the pipe. So we want it off center just a little bit, and then we'll turn it on. So the key now is to find kind of the right flow, because the water is going to kind of build up in here, and then it's going to drain through the bottom and then get recirculated. But draining through the grain doesn't happen at kind of full blast. So we're going to kind of start maybe halfway, and then we're going to stir it using the spoon. All right, so we've got kind of this side stirred, and then we can move the spigot over to this side. Just helps kind of move the water around a little bit. You can see that the water is starting to collect now, so we might want to turn it, just slow it down just a bit. All right, so now I'm kind of just find that the spoon is a little bendy. So what I try and do is, once I've kind of got the top really well mixed in, I just kind of get right to the bottom and then use almost like spinning motion to try and kind of feel the bottom, make sure that there's nothing kind of clumping at the bottom so that the water can flow well. We can see the color on the beer is starting to change, which is good. And we want to make sure that we're going to kind of mix all that up, make sure that there are no dry clumps. This does take a couple of minutes, right? So maybe 4 or 5 minutes until you make sure you've got everything, making sure you get to the bottom. You don't want any kind of clumps of dry stuff. And then once it's fully kind of mixed in, then we'll add the lid. All right, so we can see now it's all mixed in. We can see that the water level is fairly high. So we're gonna, again, kind of just close that a little bit, slow down the stream. Now we're gonna take this cap off, and we're gonna take our lid here, and this sits on top. Okay, so we're gonna actually turn this off, let it drain a little bit. So this lid just kind of sits on top, and then we have this overflow valve. Okay, so we're gonna take this end, kind of the flat end, and it goes onto our pipe here. We can kind of push this down a little bit, and that's why you didn't want it to be stuck in that little groove, that second pipe. So you can kind of push it down here to about there. That way it gives some room to move up. We can see that with the pump off, it's not really draining particularly well. So we're gonna kind of just turn the pump on just a little bit. And now we can move to our temperature. So if we look at our recipe, right, we need 67 degrees. So I'm going to pause this, set the temperature to 67. So here we're gonna go down from 72 to 67, and then we will turn it on. Right now, we've got both the 1000 watt and the 500 watt. We don't want to burn, so we're going to turn our 1000 watt off. So we're just going to run off the 500 watt heater so that we don't burn or scald the bottom of our pot. Right, so now this is a decent flow, right? It hasn't really, you can still see the screen there. So we're going to leave this now for 1 hour. Okay, so it's been a few minutes. It's a good idea to check on it every 5 or 6 minutes or so. So we can see it's draining kind of a little bit faster. So I will just kind of turn, just make it a little bit faster. And you're trying to find that kind of ideal kind of balance between the liquid kind of recirculating enough, but you don't want to kind of dry out the bottom or completely drown out the bottom so that you end up scalding. So you got to kind of check on it. You know, it's not hard, but you just need to come back maybe every 5 or 6 minutes just to check on the levels to make sure if you need to turn it up or down. Okay, so it's been about half an hour. So I'm looking here. So now it's starting to drain quite a bit faster, so I can turn up, speed up the flow a little bit. I've been checking on it every 5 to 7 minutes or so. Yeah, so this is doing well. You can see here it's starting to kind of collect a little bit, so I'll just dial it back. Good. Okay, so with about 20 minutes left in your mash process, you need to start thinking about heating up your sparge water. So the sparge water is what we're going to use to rinse the grain. Okay, so here we need 14 liters, and we need to heat it up to 76 degrees Celsius. So I have my candy thermometer. I've got my 2 pots of water heating up. So I will just leave this in here and kind of keep checking on the temperature. Once it gets to that temperature, I'll just turn it off, leave it on the stove with the lid on, and then come and grab it when my mash is done. All right, so our hour is up. So we are going to pause the heater. I'm going to turn our elements off. We're going to turn off our pump. We're also going to close our valve. We're going to move our spigot out of the way. So now we're going to put the handle back in the hole, and we're going to pull the entire grain bucket up. We're going to give it kind of a quarter turn so that the legs sit on the rests, and we're going to let it drain. Okay, so we have the grain bucket out. You can hear that it's draining. You can see that the legs are resting on those supports. You'll see how kind of tall it is. I use this fold-out table. I keep the legs nice and short. If you work on a regular height table or a counter, just make sure you've got a step stool so that you can get up here. So for me, it's kind of shoulder height, so it is fairly tall. It's just something to kind of think about ahead of time, is where your work surface is going to be. Okay, so we're going to kind of let this drain out. Once the drips kind of slow down, then we're going to bring our sparge water and we're going to rinse the grain. This process takes about a half hour, so again, it's pretty slow kind of draining. But we're basically going to be taking all of the starch and sugar that's kind of hanging out in the grain right now and rinse it out and collect it in the drum. So we can hear that the dripping is kind of slowed down now. I have one of my pots of sparge water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump approximately half of the pot of water into my grain bucket here and let it drain. And when it gets to about kind of the speed of dripping, I'll add the second half of that pot. And I'll keep the lid on the pot to keep the water warm. Yeah. So I've added half of that pot. We can see that the water is in there. It's draining through. And you can hear that water dripping through. Once it slows down, I'll add the second half of my pot. And I'll repeat the same process with my second pot of Sparge water. All right, so the sparging is done. It's done draining. We've got the handle in there so that we can pick it up. Again, being careful because that handle does slip a little bit. And I've got a container here with a empty garbage bag. So it's still going to keep kind of dripping for a little bit. Just know that it's like really full of sugars. So whatever liquid is going to kind of drip out of there is going to be quite sticky. So to make the cleanup easier, that's why I just use a container with a garbage bag, and I just dump it in the garbage bag. It's still pretty hot in there, so I'm going to let it cool probably until the whole boil is done, and then as I'm cleaning everything up is when I just dump the grain into the bag. Okay, so looking at our recipe again, we're ready to set up for the boil. So the boil time here is going to be an hour. So we're going to bring the temperature up to an hour. And if we look at the hops, so I'm using hops at 3 different points in time. So they're, in my case here, they're the same hops. There's different amounts. So I'm going to start with 1 ounce. And as soon as the beer starts to boil, I'm going to add that 1 ounce of hops. And then with 45 minutes left in the boil, so 15 minutes later, I'm going to add another ½ ounce. And then with 10 minutes left in the boil, I'm going to add the last ½ ounce. Okay. So let's get ready for the boil. So we'll put our lid back on. And it's good to have the lid on. It keeps, again, that heat in, allows it to heat up and stay warmer for longer. So we're going to set up our spigot so that we're above. We'll turn our pump on and turn our valve on. Here we can get a pretty good quick flow. Again, we want the water, or we want the wort to kind of boil. So we want to kind of recirculate that quickly so it doesn't burn at the bottom. So we're going to set our temperature, and we're going to increase that all the way up to, and when we get to 100, it'll change to this HH, so that's what we want. Hot, I don't know what HH stands for. So we're going to start that. We'll turn, for now, we'll turn our 1000 watt element on. I'll leave it on for a couple of minutes, and then I'll come on and I'll switch to the 500 again. I don't want to scorch the bottom, but because I'm able to recycle that fairly quickly, and you know, liquid won't really stay at the bottom too much. It should recycle through quickly. I'm not too concerned, but again, I won't leave it on until the whole time. I'll just kind of alternate between the 1000 watt and the 500 watt just to kind of speed up the process a little bit. Okay, so the temperature gets to about 97 degrees. That's kind of the boiling temperature, so it won't get quite to 100. So I've got just the 500 watt heater going. If we look up in here, we can kind of see that it is boiling. You'll notice it probably foams up quite a bit during the heating process, and then when it starts to boil, the foam kind of goes down. So for now, we've got my hops, we've got the hop spider that has been sanitized. So we're just going to turn off the valve for a moment, take the lid off. Right, so we can see it's boiling. We've got the hop spider full of our hops. We will set it in. Okay, and now let's put that lid back on. Okay, so the lid is back on. We'll turn our pump back on. And now you can see it's going into the hop spider. So now the hops are kind of getting mixed up, or the flavor anyways is going to get mixed up without all of the kind of gunk getting into the machine. So if we look at our recipe, okay, so we're going to need to add our next set of hops, so half an ounce at 45 minutes left. So we're going to set the timer for 15 minutes. Okay, so we are ready to add our second batch of hops to the hop slider. Put our lid back on. And good for, so that was at 45 minutes. So we're gonna go for another 35 minutes and then add the last half ounce of hops. Okay, so the boil is over. So now I've got my cooling coil in here. I've got it connected to my garden hose and I've got it running out. So now as the cold water comes in, runs through the coil, cools it off, warm water goes out. So I'm going to turn my pump back on to recirculate all of that. Now I've got my elements turned off. I've paused the heater and now I want to get my temperature down to about 23 degrees and then I can convert it or transfer it to my fermenting bucket. So you can see already it's starting to cool quite a bit. Yeah, so that's the next step. All right, so the temperature is now cooled off. So we've got the hose here just emptying into our bucket. Yeah, so you'll probably notice it'll foam up as it cools off. Fill your bucket, and at this point, when it's empty or when your bucket is full, you can add your yeast, ferment, and then you're about 2 weeks from grain to brain.